When I moved into the old apartment, I didn't expect much. It was a bit run down, but the rent was cheap, and it was in a quiet neighborhood. The previous tenant had left in a hurry, the landlord said, but that wasn't unusual in a place like this. People came and went, especially in buildings this old. The first few days passed uneventfully as I unpacked and settled into the space. The apartment was small, with creaky floors and old fixtures, but it had a kind of charm. It felt lived in. One thing I noticed right away, though, was the static. It wasn't constant, but every so often my TV or radio would cut out for a few seconds, replaced by a harsh, crackling noise. I assumed it was just interference from old wiring or the thick walls of the building, so I didn't think much of it. It wasn't until the third or fourth day that things began to shift. I'd been watching TV late at night, a mindless show to wind down before bed. The static interrupted again, louder this time, filling the room with that harsh, grating sound. But something was different. This time, it lingered, lasting longer than usual, long enough for me to reach for the remote, thinking I might need to reset the TV. Then the screen flickered, and for a brief moment there was an image. It was so fast that I barely registered it, but I could have sworn I saw something, a room dimly lit, with a figure standing near the back. Before I could process it, the show returned as if nothing had happened. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself that I was just tired. Maybe I had imagined it, or maybe it was a glitch in the signal. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen, the figure in the static, barely visible but unmistakably there. The next day, the static returned, this time on the radio. I had it playing softly in the background while I worked. But the sudden burst of static cut through the music, sharp and jarring. Again, the sound lasted longer than it should have, and this time I didn't see an image but felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, like something was hovering just outside of my vision, lurking beyond the edges of my awareness. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling. I tried watching TV again, but the static returned, louder and more persistent than before. This time, when the screen flickered, the image stayed for longer than a second. It was the same room, small and dimly lit, the walls covered in some kind of peeling wallpaper. The figure was there again, standing motionless in the center of the room, barely visible in the gloom. Its outline was shadowy, but there was something undeniably human about it. I turned off the TV, unnerved. I didn't want to think about it anymore, but the image stayed with me, burned into my mind. That night, I woke up to the sound of static. The TV was off, but the sound was unmistakable. It filled the room, though I couldn't tell where it was coming from. I sat up, listening, feeling a strange unease settling over me. The static crackled, growing louder until it seemed to fill the entire apartment. I walked through the darkened hallway, the sound of the static growing sharper, more insistent. It was coming from the other room, the spare room I hadn't really used yet. I hadn't even bothered to unpack in there. When I opened the door, the sound stopped. The room was still, the air heavy with dust. I switched on the light, half expecting to see something out of place, but everything looked normal. The old boxes were stacked against the walls, untouched. The window was closed, the blinds drawn. There was nothing that could have caused the sound. I left the light on that night, too uneasy to sleep in total darkness. The apartment was quiet again, but my mind wouldn't let go of the static. I kept thinking about that room, the one I'd seen on the screen, and how it felt strangely familiar. It wasn't my apartment, but there was something about it that seemed too real to dismiss. Over the next few days, the static became a regular occurrence. It wasn't just on the TV or the radio anymore, it was everywhere. In the silence of the apartment, I could hear it faintly, like the low hum of some distant signal. At night, it crept into my dreams, filling them with disjointed images of that same room, the figure always standing there watching. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening, what I had been seeing. I pulled out my phone and started searching for any history of the building, trying to find some explanation for the strange interference. I found nothing, no accidents, no strange deaths, no reason to explain why the static was happening. The previous tenants had moved out without any complaints, as far as I could tell. Then one night, everything escalated. I was sitting on the couch, the TV off, when the static came again, loud and all-consuming. This time it wasn't just the sound. The lights flickered and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. My breath caught in my throat as the TV clicked on by itself, the screen buzzing with static. Slowly, an image began to form. It was the room again, clearer this time, as if I were looking directly into it. The figure was closer now, no longer standing in the background. It had moved toward the camera, toward me. The screen crackled, distorting, but the figure remained. It was standing in the center of the room, staring straight ahead, though I couldn't see its face. Its form was blurry, as if it were made of the same static that filled the screen. My pulse quickened as the image flickered, and for the first time I noticed the room wasn't empty. There was something else there, something small and dark, barely visible in the corner. I felt a sudden urge to turn around, but I couldn't. My eyes were locked on the screen, on the figure that seemed to be moving closer, the static growing louder, the room on the screen growing sharper and more detailed. I could see the peeling wallpaper now, the cracks in the walls, the faint outline of something hanging in the shadows. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the static stopped. The screen went black, the room falling silent once more. I sat there, staring at the dark TV, my heart racing, the silence almost suffocating, but in the quiet that followed, I could still hear it, faint, barely there, but unmistakable. The static was coming from the spare room again. We used to go camping in the woods behind my uncle's cabin every summer. It was deep enough in the forest that you could barely hear the sounds of the highway, just the wind in the trees and the distant calls of wildlife. The first few nights were always peaceful, the campfire crackling and our conversations fading as we drifted to sleep under the stars. But this time something changed. On the third night, we heard the voice. It was late, and we were sitting around the dying fire, mostly quiet, listening to the distant rustle of the trees in the night. The woods stretched out in every direction, black beyond the flickering edge of the flames. That's when we first noticed it, soft, barely audible at first, like a whisper carried on the wind. I thought it was just a trick of the forest, maybe an animal or some far-off sound bouncing between the trees. But the more we listened, the more it became clear. It wasn't just random noise, it was a voice, faint, distant, but unmistakable. We froze, straining to hear. It was calling out, a soft, eerie tone that seemed to drift closer, then fade again, almost like it was circling us. It was hard to tell which direction it was coming from at first. The sound was strange, too soft to belong to any of us, too human to be mistaken for an animal. But no one else was out here. The nearest town was miles away, and we hadn't seen anyone else since we'd arrived. As the voice floated through the trees again, it was clearer this time, closer. It was almost as if it were calling for someone, its tone rising and falling in a way that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There was something off about it, something unnatural. We looked at each other, trying to figure out what to do. None of us moved, as if waiting for it to stop, waiting for it to fade back into the woods like an echo that would eventually disappear. But it didn't. It came again, this time louder and with a strange cadence, like it was beckoning us, like it wanted us to follow. Against my better judgment, I stood up. There was a part of me that needed to know where it was coming from, needed to know who or what was making that sound. The others stayed by the fire as I took a few steps into the tree line, trying to peer into the darkness. The woods were unnervingly quiet apart from that voice. Even the usual night sounds, the crickets, the distant hoots of owls had gone silent. I couldn't see anything, just the dark shapes of trees, barely illuminated by the glow of the campfire behind me. The voice called again, soft but insistent, and I took a few more steps, moving further away from the safety of the light. I didn't know why I kept going, but there was something about the voice that pulled at me, something that made me want to keep listening, to keep following. The deeper into the trees I went, the clearer the voice became. It was speaking words now, though I still couldn't make them out. The tone was strange, almost familiar, like someone I should have known. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't find its source. The trees around me grew denser, their shadows swallowing up any trace of light from the campfire. I stopped, standing still, listening. The voice was close now, much closer than before, as if it were right in front of me. Yet I still couldn't see anything. My pulse quickened as I scanned the darkness, but all I could see were the outlines of trees looming in the shadows. And then it was gone. The silence that followed was immediate, total. The voice had disappeared as suddenly as it had come. The woods were completely still, as if they were waiting, holding their breath. I stood there for a long moment, listening, but the voice didn't return. Just the cold, suffocating quiet of the forest at night. A sudden rustling behind me broke the silence, and I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a dark shape moving between the trees, just beyond the edge of my vision. But when I blinked, it was gone. The woods around me were still empty, as if nothing had ever been there. I made my way back to the camp as fast as I could without running, my eyes darting between the trees. My friends were sitting around the fire, looking pale, like they had heard it too, like they had been waiting for me to return. None of us said anything as I sat back down. The voice was gone, but the night felt heavy, like something was watching us from just beyond the light. We didn't sleep that night. The fire burned low, casting long shadows around our campsite, and every so often I would glance towards the tree line, half expecting to hear that voice again. But it never came back. The woods stayed silent, the darkness pressing in closer as the hours passed. The next morning we packed up and left early. None of us talked about what we'd heard. It was like we didn't want to admit that it had happened, like we were all trying to convince ourselves it was just a trick of the wind, a strange sound that had no real meaning, but I knew better. Even now, years later, I can still hear it sometimes. That voice, calling softly from somewhere deep in the trees, always just out of sight, always just beyond the edge of the light. It's as if it's still waiting, still hoping someone will follow. When I was a kid, we lived next door to an old woman named Mrs. Carver. Her house was small, a simple one-story place with faded yellow paint and a garden that always seemed overgrown, no matter how much time she spent tending to it. She lived alone for as long as I could remember, and though she was kind to the neighborhood kids, she always kept to herself. When Mrs. Carver passed away, the house was left untouched. Her family never came to clean it out or sell it, so it sat there, aging like a forgotten relic of a different time. We used to dare each other to go up to her porch, peer in the windows, but no one ever had the courage to step inside. That summer, boredom and curiosity got the best of us. My friends and I had been talking for weeks about sneaking into Mrs. Carver's house, and one afternoon we decided to finally do it. The front door was locked, but we found a broken window around the back, just big enough to climb through. The house felt frozen in time. Her furniture was still in place, as if she had just stepped out for a moment and would be back any second. Everything was covered in dust, thick enough that it stirred in the air when we walked. I stayed downstairs while the others explored. There was an eerie stillness to the house, a kind of silence that made every little sound seem amplified. I walked through the living room, where a few old family photos still hung on the walls. One of the pictures caught my eye. It was of Mrs. Carver, much younger, standing beside a man I didn't recognize. He was tall, serious-looking, with an old-fashioned suit that seemed out of place next to her bright smile. The more I stared at the photo, the more I realized something was off. I had never seen anyone else in the house. Mrs. Carver had always been alone. There were never any visitors, no signs that anyone else had ever lived there with her. Yet here he was, captured in this picture, standing so close to her it seemed they must have been family or something more. I moved into the hallway, the wooden floor creaking softly under my feet. The walls were lined with more pictures, but they were different from the ones in the living room. These were older, faded, and some were hard to make out through the grime. Yet, in each one, that same man appeared, standing in the background, always near her, but never quite looking at the camera. His expression never changed. He stood still, his face blank and distant, as if he wasn't really there. I felt a chill as I passed by the kitchen. There were still dishes in the sink, cups left on the counter, all coated in a fine layer of dust. The house had been untouched for so long, yet everything felt as though it had been abandoned suddenly, as if whoever had lived here had simply walked away and never returned. A soft sound caught my attention. It was faint, like the creak of a floorboard upstairs. My friends were still somewhere above me, but this noise didn't sound like them. It was too slow, too measured, like someone carefully moving from room to room. I walked towards the stairs, my heart beating a little faster. The sound grew louder as I approached, steady, though nothing else moved. I stopped at the base of the staircase, listening. The house felt cold, much colder than it had when we first entered. The air hung heavy, and the light through the windows seemed to dim as the afternoon clouds rolled in. Upstairs, something shifted again. A soft thud, like something falling to the floor, followed by another creak, heavier this time. I called out to my friends, but there was no response. The silence that followed was more unsettling than the sound itself. It pressed in on me, stretching the space between my breath. I took a step back, unsure if I wanted to go up there or not. The hallway behind me seemed darker now, as though the shadows had deepened in the time I'd been standing there. Another noise came from above, this time clearer, a sound like something being dragged across the floor. I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and rushed out of the house, leaving through the same broken window we had entered. Outside, the air felt lighter, the sunlight harsh after the gloom inside. My friends were already outside, waiting for me with nervous smiles like they'd been there for a while. They hadn't heard anything unusual, they said. They'd been upstairs the whole time, rummaging through old boxes and cabinets, and they hadn't seen or heard anyone else. But I couldn't shake what I'd heard. Those footsteps, those sounds from upstairs, they hadn't belonged to any of us. Later that night, lying in bed, I couldn't get the image of the man in the photo out of my mind. I kept thinking about how he had appeared in so many pictures. Yet no one had ever mentioned him. No one in the neighborhood had ever seen him. It was as if he had existed only in that house, only in the shadows of Mrs. Carver's life. Sometimes late at night, when I was alone in my room, I'd hear the faintest creak from the walls next door, the sound of floorboards settling under the weight of something unseen. I tried to convince myself it was just the house settling, just the natural sounds of an old building falling into decay, but the memory of those footsteps never really left me. I avoided walking past that house from then on, but even years later I could still feel it there, standing silent and empty, with something in it that should have been long gone. It was late, and I was walking home after a long night at the bar. The streets were empty, the quiet of the city settling in as the last remnants of nightlife faded into silence. I'd made the walk 100 times before, and I knew every corner, every alleyway, but that night something was different. As I rounded a familiar block, I noticed a side street I'd never seen before. It was dimly lit, barely visible under the flickering glow of an old street lamp. Curiosity tugged at me, and I turned onto the unfamiliar road. The pavement beneath my feet felt uneven, cracked in places as though it had been forgotten long ago. The houses lining the street were strange. Each one looked similar, yet slightly off. They were tidy, but there was no life in them. The windows were large, dark, and empty, as if no one had looked through them in years. The porches were bare, the doors closed, and no light shone from inside. I continued walking, drawn further down the street by an unshakable sense that I needed to see more. The night felt colder the deeper I went. There was no sound, no distant hum of traffic, no wind rustling through the trees, just the soft crunch of my footsteps on the worn pavement. As I passed the houses, I noticed the odd repetition. They weren't just similar, they were identical. Same chipped paint, same sagging roofs, same cracked driveways. The symmetry was unsettling in a way I couldn't place. I tried to shake off the unease, convincing myself it was just an odd coincidence, but as I looked further ahead, I realized the pattern continued for as far as I could see. I stopped and turned, intending to retrace my steps and head back to the main road. But when I looked behind me, the street wasn't there anymore. Where I had just come from, there was only an endless stretch of more identical houses, stretching into the distance, as if the street had swallowed the way I came. My heart began to race, a pulse of unease rising in my chest. The buildings loomed taller now, their dark windows staring blankly, offering no comfort. I walked faster, trying to get back to where I'd started, but the road ahead offered no end, only more of the same. Each house was a mirror image of the last, a strange, sterile version of the home next door. My footsteps quickened, echoing off the pavement in the silence, but no matter how far I went, the street didn't change. There were no cars parked in front of the houses, no lights flickering on in the windows, no signs of life anywhere. The longer I walked, the the more I felt as though I was the only living thing that had been here in years. The cold seemed to seep deeper into my bones, and the silence grew thicker with every step. I glanced up, expecting to see the sky or the distant city skyline, but even the stars were gone, hidden behind a layer of dark clouds that had crept in without my noticing. The street was the only thing that existed now, stretching endlessly in both directions. Then from somewhere behind me I heard it, a faint sound, footsteps. They were soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. They matched the rhythm of my own steps, always just a little behind. I quickened my pace, but the sound persisted, steady, constant, just out of sight. I walked faster, almost breaking into a run, but no matter how far I went, the houses remained the same, the street continuing in a loop with no exit. My breath came in short, panicked bursts, and the cold seemed to close in tighter, pressing against my skin. I refused to look back. The footsteps were closer now, keeping pace with me, always just behind. My mind raced, searching for some explanation, some way out, but the street continued on and the houses never changed. After what felt like an eternity, I finally saw an end ahead, a dead end. A brick wall blocked the road, standing tall and unyielding. My pulse pounded in my ears as I reached it, my back pressed against the cold bricks. The footsteps behind me stopped, the silence suddenly complete. I stood there breathless, staring at the wall, unwilling to turn around. When I finally did, expecting to see the endless street and those repeating houses, I saw something different. The road had shifted back to normal. The houses were gone, replaced by the familiar city streets I knew so well. There was no trace of the strange road, no sign of the endless rows of identical homes. But as I looked around, still catching my breath, I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't truly left that place. Even now, I sometimes hear footsteps outside my window late at night, the faint sound of shoes hitting pavement, always moving just behind me. The radio station was infamous in our small town, though no one ever bothered to check it out. It had been abandoned for decades after the flood, left to rot as nature overtook its crumbling walls. The few who lived through the disaster rarely spoke of it, and those who did always grew quiet when the station came up. For me, it was just a ruin on the outskirts, something I'd pass on my late-night drives home from work. Last night, the fog hung low as I drove along the old road. I was exhausted, eager to get home. As I passed the station, I noticed something strange. My radio cut out. I was in the middle of listening to a podcast, but it suddenly stopped, replaced by static. I didn't think much of it at first, figured it was just interference, but then, through the hissing and crackling, I heard what sounded like a voice. It wasn't a normal voice, it was faint and distorted, almost like it was coming from underwater. At first it was so soft that I couldn't make out what it was saying, but it grew clearer the longer I listened. My curiosity got the better of me and I slowed the car, rolling to a stop just outside the station's sagging chain-link fence. The building loomed in the fog, its shadow barely visible against the dark sky. I fiddled with the radio dial, hoping to tune the signal. The voice sharpened, though I still couldn't make out any specific words. The tone was urgent, strained, like it was calling out from some deep place. For a moment I sat there, transfixed by the garbled sound coming through my speakers, feeling a pull that was impossible to explain. There was a strange rhythmic noise behind the voice, almost like a tapping, faint but persistent. It didn't match the static, and it wasn't random. I turned off the radio, but I could still hear the tapping, now louder. I realized it was coming from the station itself. I don't know why I got out of the car. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something else that I couldn't quite name. The building looked worse up close. The windows were shattered, the walls streaked with grime, but there was a stillness about it that made everything else seem muted. I approached the door, noticing how the wood had warped and cracked over the years. When I pressed my ear against the rough surface, the tapping grew clearer, echoing from deep inside the station. It was steady, consistent. A chill ran through me, though the night wasn't particularly cold. I felt drawn to it. The rhythm, like a code I couldn't quite decipher. I stayed like that for a while, listening. Time seemed to stretch as the tapping went on. Steady and unchanging, it was impossible to ignore. Eventually, I recognized what it was. It was too precise to be random. Someone was sending a message. I stumbled back, my heart pounding. It wasn't just noise. The realization came over me in waves. It wasn't my mind playing tricks. This was real. I ran back to my car, my skin crawling with the realization that I'd been listening to something that shouldn't exist, something that lingered in that ruined building. As I drove away, the radio flickered back on, briefly filling the car with that same distorted voice. I didn't stop to listen. I kept driving, the faint rhythm of tapping still echoing in my head. When I finally reached home, I couldn't sleep. I found myself replaying the sound over and over, unable to shake it. This morning I looked up Morse code. My hands shook as I tapped out the pattern I'd heard so clearly, certain I had misunderstood it, but it was unmistakable. It spelled a single word: help. There's a section of track way out in the countryside that people avoid. The locals know it's haunted, but you won't find any official reports or warnings about it. The train companies don't acknowledge the stretch of rail for what it is, and they keep running trains through it. But everyone who's spent time near it knows better. It was a cold night, and I was taking a train home after a long business trip. The ride was supposed to be uneventful, just another overnight stretch where you close your eyes and try to sleep, lulled by the rumble of the tracks. The train wasn't full, just a few passengers scattered throughout the car, all keeping to themselves. Around midnight, the train began to slow. I glanced out the window, expecting to see a station coming up, but there was nothing. Just dark fields stretching out as far as I could see, the moon barely lighting up the landscape. The train crept to a crawl, then stopped completely. No announcements, no explanation, just stillness. At first, I thought it was a routine stop or maybe a delay, but as the minutes passed, I began to notice something odd. The other passengers weren't reacting. They sat in their seats, staring ahead, unmoving. No one got up to check what was happening. No one glanced at their phones or looked out the windows. It was as if they were frozen in time. The lights in the car flickered, dimming slightly, casting strange shadows along the walls. I shifted uncomfortably, feeling a sudden chill wrap around me. That's when I noticed her. A woman stood at the far end of the train car. She hadn't been there before, I was sure of it. She wore an old-fashioned dress, pale and worn like something from another century. Her hair hung loosely around her face, and she was staring straight at me. There was something unsettling about her eyes. Too dark, too empty. The train jerked forward slightly, but instead of speeding up, it seemed to move slower, as if struggling against something unseen. The woman took a step closer. No sound, no shuffle of feet, just a faint ripple in the air as she advanced. My heart pounded as I tried to look away, but I couldn't. Her gaze was fixed on me, cold and unyielding. The rest of the passengers remained still, oblivious to her presence. She was getting closer now, her pale form drifting through the aisle, her expression blank yet somehow intent. I could hear a low murmur surrounding me, a sound that seemed to fill the silence of the train, echoing softly in my ears. The closer she got, the more the lights flickered, casting her form in and out of shadow. Her face, once expressionless, began to shift slightly, the features distorting as she moved. I wanted to get up, to run, but my body refused to obey. All I could do was watch as she reached the seat beside mine, her figure now inches away. The train lurched again, this time with a force that nearly knocked me from my seat. The woman stopped, standing so close that I could feel an icy chill emanating from her. Her mouth opened, but no sound escaped. Just the same eerie whisper that seemed to drift through the train. And then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the train roared back to life, speeding down the tracks as though nothing had occurred. The lights ceased flickering and the car warmed up again. The woman was gone. I looked around, heart racing, but no one else seemed to have noticed. The passengers were awake now, looking at their phones or out the windows, as if nothing had happened. The train rolled on toward the next station, no sign of the strange stop, no hint of what had just transpired. When I arrived at my destination, I asked one of the workers about the unexpected stop in the middle of the night, about the strange stretch of track. He didn't meet my eyes when he responded, but he said enough to confirm what I already knew. The train wasn't supposed to stop there. I left the station, the night air biting at my skin, and couldn't shake the image of the woman from my mind. The chill from her presence lingered in my bones, and the low whisper echoed in my thoughts. I couldn't stop wondering about those other passengers, what they had seen or felt, if anything at all. In the days that followed, I tried to brush off the encounter. I went back to my routine, taking trains and buses, returning to work, but something changed within me. Every time I heard the distant rumble of a train, I felt that familiar chill creeping back in. The image of that old-fashioned woman haunted my dreams, her eyes always watching, always waiting. Then one night I received a call from an old friend. He was planning a trip through the countryside and he wanted to know if I'd join him. The thought of that stretch of track sent a wave of dread through me, but I couldn't say no. I agreed, hoping that maybe it had just been my imagination. As we drove through the darkness toward the train station, I tried to convince myself that everything would be fine. I told myself I was being silly, that I wouldn't see her again. But when we stepped onto the platform, a sense of foreboding settled over me like a heavy blanket. The train arrived, and I felt the familiar rumble beneath my feet. It was late, and the platform was empty aside from us and a few stragglers waiting for the next ride. As we boarded the train, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass of the window. For a moment I thought I saw her behind me, her pale form lurking just out of view, but I shook it off. It was just the darkness playing tricks. I took my seat beside my friend, trying to focus on the journey ahead, to enjoy the ride and put the past behind me. The train lurched forward and I watched the landscape blur past outside. The fields were dark and still, bathed in moonlight. As we traveled further along, the familiar sense of unease crept back into my chest. The lights flickered and I glanced around the car. My friend was engrossed in his phone, completely oblivious to the shadows gathering at the edges of the aisle. The train slowed suddenly, and I felt my heart drop. The stillness returned, punctuated only by the faint hum of the engine. I looked around. The other passengers remained frozen, their gazes vacant, just as they had been that first night. And then I saw her. The woman stood at the far end of the car, her figure barely illuminated by the flickering lights. This time I didn't even try to look away. I was rooted in place, my heart pounding in my chest as she took a single step forward. The train lurched again, and the world around us fell silent, the whisper growing louder, swirling around us like a dark mist. In that moment, I realized I had brought my friend into this. I had opened the door to whatever haunted that stretch of track. The darkness deepened, and the train rolled on, leaving behind the living world, inching closer to the unknown. I'd been driving long-haul trucks for over 20 years. It's a job that gets into your blood, the rhythm of the road, the endless stretches of asphalt rolling beneath you, the gentle hum of the engine as you carve through the night. I was used to the solitude, the peace that comes with long drives across the countryside, especially on those dark, quiet highways where few dared to venture. One night, I found myself navigating a desolate stretch of highway in Texas. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the road. There were no other vehicles in sight, just my truck and the black expanse of night surrounding me. It was one of those rare nights when everything felt serene, a perfect backdrop for the solitude I craved. As I drove, the world outside my windshield melted into a blur of shadows and light. I lost myself in the monotony of the road, each mile marker ticking by with the promise of the horizon. It was around 2 a.m. when I first noticed the headlights. They were far behind me at first, small and flickering like a distant star, but they grew brighter and closer with alarming speed. I glanced at my speedometer, frowning. I was pushing the limit, but nothing reckless. Yet the vehicle behind me closed the distance rapidly. It didn't make sense. The headlights moved in a way that felt almost unnatural, like it was a predator stalking its prey. I turned the radio down, straining to hear the sound of the engine, but there was only my truck's roar breaking the silence. The headlights shot past me in an instant, barely registering before they vanished ahead. My heart raced. I was certain it had to be a sports car or some local kid pushing their luck, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I glanced into the rearview mirror, searching for any sign of the vehicle, but all I saw was darkness stretching behind me. Then, just as I thought I could relax, I saw it again. The same headlights, brighter this time, appearing out of the darkness ahead. My gut twisted as the car barreled toward me, not slowing at all. I hit the brakes, adrenaline flooding my veins, and veered to the side, praying I wouldn't end up in a ditch. My truck skidded, but thankfully remained upright. The moment I regained control, I looked ahead, but the car had vanished again, swallowed by the night. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. It was like being chased by a ghost. I pressed on, refusing to let fear dictate my actions, but the tension lingered in the pit of my stomach. After a few more miles, I relaxed slightly, convincing myself it was just a trick of the mind. I kept my focus on the road, willing the landscape to change, waiting for the familiar landmarks to reappear. Yet, as I drove further into the night, I spotted movement on the side of the road. A figure stood there, half shrouded in shadows. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing ragged clothing. I felt an instinctive dread creeping over me. I couldn't shake the sensation that he was watching me. My gaze flicked to the figure, then back to the road, hoping that this was just a momentary distraction. But as I passed him, I felt an icy chill race down my spine. The man didn't move, his hollow eyes fixed on me as if he knew exactly who I was. A shudder rippled through me, and I pressed the accelerator, wanting to put as much distance between me and the figure as possible. Not long after, the headlights reappeared, now directly in front of me again. This time there was no denying it. The car surged forward, accelerating with unnatural speed, blocking my path. I slammed my brakes, skidding across the asphalt as the truck swayed. The figure was there again, somehow closer now, standing just off the road, watching, waiting. The headlights vanished as quickly as they had come, and I found myself alone again, with only the distant sound of my engine and the eerie silence of the empty highway. But the unsettling feeling lingered, a weight pressing on my chest. The man's eyes burned into my memory, and I couldn't shake the thought that I wasn't alone. My knuckles were white as I gripped the steering wheel, forcing myself to focus. I was losing my mind. I told myself it was fatigue or perhaps too much caffeine. I turned the radio back on, hoping the music would drown out the thoughts swirling in my mind. But as the notes floated through the cab, the headlights returned, flickering in my rearview mirror once more. They were closer now, taunting me as if to remind me that I couldn't escape. I tried to push the fear down, to tell myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the headlights grew brighter, illuminating the inside of my truck as they drew nearer, matching my speed with eerie precision. I glanced to the side of the road, hoping to see signs of life, but it was just me and the darkness stretching on. The figure appeared again, always just out of reach. I could feel my heart racing as I pushed the truck to its limits, desperate to outrun whatever haunted me. The headlights flickered again, and suddenly the world around me fell silent, enveloped in darkness. The truck's engine sputtered and died, leaving me in an eerie stillness. The dashboard lights flickered out, plunging me into a suffocating black. I gripped the wheel tightly, panic surging through me as I frantically turned the key, trying to restart the engine. Nothing. I was trapped in that desolate night, with the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on me. The whispers began to creep in, a chorus of murmurs that echoed through the cab, intertwining with the shadows. The headlights were gone, but the chilling presence of that figure lingered, haunting the edges of my vision. I was paralyzed, trapped in my truck, and every instinct screamed at me to run. But there was nowhere to go. The darkness closed in around me, and in that moment of isolation, I knew I was not just a driver on an empty road. I was prey, caught in a web woven by something that would never let me go. In the distance, I thought I saw a flicker of light, a sign of hope, or perhaps another trap. I was alone on that road, but I felt the weight of eyes, the presence of that figure, always watching, always waiting. And deep down, I knew that no matter how far I drove, I could never truly escape.